This is a 7K torsion. This axle came in because it is bent. So this is the inside of a torsion. We rarely ever convert from a spring to a torsion unless we're needing to do something custom. It is definitely cheaper to replace a spring axle compared to a torsion axle. Welcome back to the TrailerSmith. Before we get into today's subject, I would just like to say our thoughts and prayers go out to all those that were affected by Hurricane Helene. Those that have lost everything they have, the loss of life. We just continue to pray for those that are assisting with recovery efforts, helping to rebuild infrastructure, roads, the linemen. Our thoughts and prayers, again, just go out. As we're filming this video, Hurricane Milton is heading straight for Florida. So by the time this is released, it will have already made landfall. So we continue to pray for them that storm will weaken. So remember them in your thoughts and prayers. Now let's jump into today's video. What is better, the torsion axle or the spring axle? We're going to cover the pros and cons of both of those axles. Stick around towards the end of the video. I'm going to give you my 3 cents worth on it today. So the first axle we're going to talk about today is the torsion axle. So let's just jump right to it. This is a 7K torsion. This axle came in because it is bent. We stripped the brake and drum and stuff so you can kind of see how it is made. So this is your spindle, similar to the spindle on a spring axle. The spindle is welded into the arm. Some torsion axles also have removable spindles. You'll see those a lot in the marine industry. And then you have your arm that comes down. And if you'll notice right here, there is a large square weld. Some axles, like we've covered in some of our marine videos, this also will bolt on here instead of welding in. But in the utility trailer and cargo and even the travel trailer RV industry, it's usually going to be this style setup. The removable spindle, removable arm is not super popular. That's more popular in the marine industry. So this right here is the workhorse of it. This is a big square piece of rod, and I have cut this axle away, so I'm going to flip this around. So this is the inside of a torsion. This piece here, this is just a piece of angle iron that is welded on from the manufacturer to run the brake wires through. This is that big piece of solid square bar that goes into the outer tube. This bar does not go all the way across. It only comes in a certain amount into the end of the tube. And then you see these 4 black pieces here. That is actually rubber. And that is your suspension. So this takes the place of a spring suspension. So when pressure or weight is put onto this arm, it articulates and it presses, the square bar presses against these rubber pieces. The only thing that holds this bar in when it's pressed in is friction. There's no bolt, there's no mechanical device, nothing like that. It's purely friction. First, I want to talk about the good things that I like about torsion axles, and we'll cover the things maybe I don't like, maybe the bad things. So the pros or the advantage of a torsion. The first thing, you have less moving components, less moving parts, because you don't have the spring suspension and everything that is associated with that. A lot of these tubes are galvanized, especially in the marine industry, so your corrosion resistance is a lot of times better on that. The main purpose of these is the smoother ride, the independent suspension, whether you're running that in a single axle setup, a tandem axle, or a triple axle, and then some configurations can be tandem dual. You get independent suspension, so all 4 wheels are doing their own work, and it's a smoother ride. So if you're on a bumpy road, you're going to get more of like an automotive style ride where you have a shock that's in place that's helping to dampen some of that bump. This is going to do that. The other advantage to the torsion axle is the warranty. 5 to 10 years with most manufacturers. Now that is limited to certain areas. And the maintenance. There is no maintenance on this. Your only maintenance would just be your brakes and your bearing pack. So no maintenance on any of this. There's no grease zerk, there's no lubrication, there's no nothing. Another advantage when you've seen on the back side, see if we can get the camera back here. So the main tube here on this setup, and again, I've cut this one off. This tube actually is considered structure for the trailer. So once this is bolted and or welded on, this can become a cross member of the trailer. A floor can sit on top of here. It will stiffen the trailer. So that is another advantage as well. Something else with torsion axles, they have multiple degree pitch configurations. So as far as ride height, so if you're building maybe a custom trailer, maybe a custom camper trailer, something that's a one-off, that you're needing a specific ride height, you can get these in multiple up positions to lower the ride height of the trailer, and you can get them in multiple down positions to raise the ride height of the trailer. And again, some come with removable spindles and removable arms. The advantage to the removable spindle just is for bearing failure. That's really the only advantage to that. If you have a bearing, maybe you've not done your maintenance, maybe you haven't packed your bearings. If you haven't packed your bearings, check out our video on that we'll leave in the description below. If you lose that bearing, chew that spindle up, and it has a removable spindle, you can just remove the spindle and not have to replace the whole axle. They also make this same setup in basically an independent. It has no cross beam. It's independent of itself, so you have a whole open pan of your trailer. You're starting to see that some in the RV industry. Multiple manufacturers are doing it. It's not new technology. It's actually been out a long time. There's some drop deck equipment trailers that haul rollers and even some scissor lift that drop on the ground. They can't have any cross beam in the middle, so this just independently either bolts or welds onto the frame of the trailer, and your whole inside pan is completely open, so there is a need for that. Now let's get into the disadvantages of it. So the first disadvantage, and this is for a lot of people, is the cost. Your initial cost on the axle. The initial cost on this is going to be pretty expensive compared if you went to go price this against just a regular 7K axle. Now, something you have to keep in mind though is you're also having to purchase the rest of the suspension components on there that we'll cover when we get to the spring axle. But that's really one of the big things that turn people off is the cost of it. I've been asked the question, how many do we convert over? We rarely ever convert from a spring to a torsion unless we're needing to do something custom. Now, we will install torsion if we're doing a custom trailer from the get-go. The other disadvantage in a tandem axle scenario is proper weight distribution between the two axles. These are really meant to be on smoother surfaces. I know we talked about bumps and stuff like that, and that's one thing, but when you have a tandem axle setup, the way this arm works, it does not load the spring up until you get weight on it. So you can imagine if you're in an off-road scenario, if you will, and you're in a tandem axle setup, and maybe you have a high and low spot, you can raise the height of this when you're loaded, and there'll be no weight on your front or your rear axle, and you can put the whole load on one side. Now, in a single axle setup where these would work great is like if you have a piece of equipment, say maybe a commercial air compressor, light tower, something like that, in a single axle, these work great. They lessen the vibration and help with any electrical components that may be in that. Some machines even require this style setup, so that is a great advantage. But in that tandem and or triple axle setup, the disadvantage is uneven ground. Somewhere else that would play in is in the cattle trailer industry. Some of our higher end cattle trailers will have a torsion axle setup. Some will have springs. The way people do that have been around this forever, if they do most of their cattle working in pasture, so if they're loading their animals maybe out in the pasture, they prefer spring axles. If they're loading their cattle to, at a nice level ground where they're taking them to sale or to transport, they're going to use torsion axles because it is a smoother ride, so more for highway use. So in my opinion, these are better for smoother highway use, even though they will dampen some of that bumping. I'm not a fan of them out in the pasture or in an off-road scenario because in a tandem axle setup, you can cheat it and get away with it in a single axle setup all day long. It'll be fine. The other disadvantage is if you were to lose your bearing setup on here and you needed a new axle, these are not as readily available as a spring axle. If you go into even a large size trailer repair shop, they may only have one or two torsion axles because, like I said earlier, there's so many different configurations, it's hard to have all of them in stock. I mean, it's pitched configurations, it is bracket type, whether that be high profile, low profile, standard profile, inboard, outboard, and what that means, inboard and outboard, is how they mount, whether they mount through the top, whether they mount through the side. So they are hard to find. If you need one of these axles, a lot of the times you're going to have to order it, and that can take, in today's world, anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks to get an axle. The other disadvantage to the torsion axle, and the whole reason this axle is on this sawhorse today, this had a curb strike. And what I mean by that, if you look, I'm gonna spin this real quick. I don't know if it'll pick it up or not. So if you can see right here, you can see there's a gap here, and up top, there is no gap. Usually what causes that, and I don't think the camera will be able to pick it up, but this arm is actually bent in. So this took a curb strike. They cut the corner too sharp. It could happen pulling a gas station or anywhere. With the torsion axle setup, you're going to take all of that hit in this one location, and there's none of this is going to give for the most part. It's going to give right here. This is the weakest point where this enters the tube, where this torsion bar enters the tube in there. This is the weak point of it. This is going to bend. Occasionally we will see the arm bend and even the spindle bend on a high-speed curb strike or a high-speed pothole encounter, and this is where it's going to bend. Once that happens, that's it. It's trash at that point. There's no straightening it out. I know people that try to straighten it out, they'll heat this up. The problem is once you heat this up, it will compromise the integrity of the rubber that holds this whole thing together and makes the suspension work. So that is a big disadvantage for curb strike, tight turns, because it's taking the whole brunt of the axle. But other than that, I'm a big fan of the torsion axle. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just maybe not for every situation. Most people today, I believe, know what a torsion axle is, but you don't know whether you need it on your trailer. Some people want to retrofit their RVs. Some people want to retrofit their utilities, dumps across the board. We honestly do not do a lot of that. We don't have a lot of call for it. Usually after I talk to people, once you tell them the price, and that will steer them clear of that. And it's not to run you off or to change your mind. It is a cost. But again, the selling point is the maintenance on it. It will last a while if you take good care of it, just like anything. So that is the torsion axle. So it's just these pieces of rubber like we showed you in here. That's your whole suspension on there, and it will give you a smooth and comfortable ride in the right scenario. So let's pull in a spring axle and we'll show you that, and then we'll compare the two. So here we have a tandem axle spring suspension, and we'll move the camera along the spring, starting with the front shackle bolt. You'll work your way back to the axle and you'll see the U-bolts, and then in the center of the trailer you will see the shackle straps, equalizer set up with all the spring and suspension bolts, and then finally we'll be back to the rear spring U-bolts, and then it attaches to the rear hanger. So there's a bunch of different components on here, and they all work together. Whether it's a 3,500 pound tandem axle setup all the way up to a 16,000 pound setup, it's going to be the same concept. Some of the parts are going to be different, but they're going to do the same thing. The way they're going to work is going to be the same. So if this were a single axle setup, you would just have your front hanger and bolt, and you would come back to a shackle setup along with a rear hanger that would go here, and that would be for your single axle setup. You wouldn't have the equalizer, center hanger, or none of the other components. So first we're going to start with the pros on our spring axle setup. The first pro for most people is going to be your initial cost or replacement cost. It is definitely cheaper to replace a spring axle compared to a torsion axle. The second pro, parts are readily available. If you go into any size trailer parts supply repair facility, more than likely they will have an axle, unless it's some custom axle that may have to be ordered. The third one, which would be my number one, would be the spring axle handles weight over time, in my opinion, better than the torsion. As we showed with the torsion, where the arm was bent due to the curb strike, over time it will put more pressure on the top of that tube and can cause the arm to lean in and will cause tire wear. And it's the same thing as a bent axle, it's just wearing that out. If I'm hauling heavy loads, I'm going to stick with a spring suspension. The cons are this: there's a lot more moving parts, as you've seen in the video, from tip to tail. There's shackle bolts, there's shackles, there's bushings, there's springs, there's U-bolts, there's equalizers. All of those things have a chance to fail, and all of those things will wear out. If you pull your trailer to any capacity, you're going to have to check those and replace them. That being said, you can find them easily, whether it be popping into a farm and ranch store or going to a parts supply. You can usually find all that in stock. If you do your maintenance and you change your bushings out in your springs, check that once a year. You can put a new nylon bushing in there. It doesn't cost much. You can even upgrade to greasable suspension bolts to get you a little more longevity out of that. If you're like me, you may or may not grease them. I just stick with the nylon. So you can find those parts easier, but you're going to have to put more hands on it. The other disadvantage is the warranty is not going to be as long on most spring axles as it is going to be compared to a torsion axle, so that'd be another con. I want to cover one more pro before we move on, and I'll tell you which one I think is better for you or better for me, and that is the ride and load displacement with the tandem axle setup on a spring axle compared to the torsion. As we talked about with the torsion, you're independent on all 4 tires. So if you hit a high spot in the road, if you hit a low spot in the road, all of that is going to be handled here. If you hit a really low spot in the road, then you're going to transfer all the weight to the rear. The other thing, if you don't have your ride height correct, if you're nose high in the front, this axle may not be doing any work on the torsion axle. It may be off the ground. You may be putting almost no load on that, and you're distributing all the load to the rear axle. So that is a disadvantage to a torsion axle, and it is an advantage in the spring axle. So I'm going to take a jack. We'll see if we can get it to move. It's a brand new suspension, so it's probably going to be a little tight. But if I put more load here, it is going to push this axle down. It's pushing that axle down because it's distributing the load from here to there and vice versa if you were doing the same thing on there. So if you don't have your trailer perfectly level, or maybe you didn't load it correctly, maybe if you have your load off, this will help you out to a point. You can get it so far off that you're going to bottom the equalizer out and you'll be in the same scenario. You've created a rigid suspension at that point, and you're going to put all the load on one axle compared to both. So I do think that's a pro on the spring axle. It has an advantage over the torsion is weight distribution on some of your heavier loads, and I think that's why it holds up better on your heavier loads with the spring suspension compared to the torsion. So here's the $1 million question: which is better, the torsion axle or the spring setup? Well, my opinion is this: they're both great in the correct application. They're both needed in the correct application. You have to be the one to determine that. I can only give you my experience, my advice. So my experience is this: if I'm hauling a cargo trailer, then I'm maybe going to have my camping gear, or maybe I'm hauling my bike around in it, or maybe I've got some construction tools in it, I'm going to want torsion 10 out of 10 times just for a smoother ride, so all my stuff is not bouncing around on the interior and the trailer hold up a little better. I do have to make sure that I keep my ride completely level, because that's the only way torsion will work correctly. If you have the trailer almost completely level once you're loaded and even unloaded. The other advantage to a torsion axle, maybe I have a one-off setup and I need the belly pan to be completely open. I'm going to go to the option to where I have a beamless torsion setup. Maybe I'm doing a drop belly pan in that configuration. If I'm moving my cattle or livestock primarily on the highway, on smooth roads, I'm going to want a torsion setup just because it's going to give them a smoother ride. Maybe you have a horse trailer that's got an LQ in it and you're hauling a horse across country. Torsion is going to be smoother 10 out of 10 times on that. Where I'm going to want a spring setup, if I'm hauling my equipment around, I'm going to want a spring setup on there. In my opinion, I can get a little better weight distribution on there and a little bit more longevity out of that. If I haul that trailer empty, it may beat my teeth out, but I'm not going to pull the trailer if it's going to be primarily empty. Another place I would want a spring setup if I'm moving my cattle out in the pasture. Around here we have a lot of property that is terraced, that is rough, that you're driving across cattle ruts that are out in the pasture, cattle trails. The torsion is going to struggle on that, and you do take a risk of bending an axle, stressing an axle just due to not proper weight distribution. So I'm going to go with a spring axle in that setup. If I have a really nice RV that I keep pretty much the same all the time and I'm just traveling nice smooth highways, do y'all have nice smooth highways there? We don't have that many around here, but hopefully you do. I'm going to go with a torsion setup just again for a smoother ride to help some of the components and not shake my dishes out of my cabinets. But if I'm going to take that trailer in more of an off-road, maybe you're boondocking or something like that, in my opinion, the spring suspension is going to be better. Something you can do if you're running a spring suspension, you can keep some of these components. I would recommend, especially if you travel cross country, keep an extra spring, some suspension bolts, even U-bolts. They may come in handy on the side of the road. There's really nothing you can carry for the torsion axle. If you bend it, if it fails, it's all she wrote. You're going to have to get you a new one. So that's my 2 cents. Remember, when you click the subscribe and give us that thumbs up, leave us a comment, give us a video idea. Share with us maybe your experience on the torsion axle. Same thing with springs. Let us know about that. We'll also leave some links in the description below that cover some of the replacement parts for spring. If you have to find some of those, you just need to make sure you know what size axle and how many leaf spring it is. With that being said, if you do need a spring, remember to always take that to your parts store with you, because there's a bunch of different measurements, eye to eye, eye to center, and different arches on the spring. So take that to help your parts guy out so he can get you what you need. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the video ideas, the great comments, and we will see you on the next one.